Hey folks! A couple of weeks ago I attended Gamehole Con in Madison, Wisconsin. I had a great time, so I figured I'd do a short recap. First of all, what's Gamehole Con? Gamehole Con is an annual gaming convention that takes place every October in Madison. I don't know the exact attendee numbers, but I believe it's around 4,000 to 5,000, which makes this a good medium-sized con. It's large enough to have a huge variety of games and a nice dealer hall, but not so large as to be overwhelming. I attended Gamehole Con for the first time 2 years ago and had an awesome time then. I was hoping to attend again last year and had everything booked, but unfortunately got COVID right before the convention, so I had to sit that one out. Of course, I was all the more excited to return this year, and it couldn't have been more successful. I met a ton of friends, played some great games, and enjoyed some good food and drinks as well. I managed to get in 10 games, so about 40 hours of gaming over a 4-day period. I was definitely wiped out at the end, but in a good way. So let's talk about the games, starting with the 2 games that I've run. Those both use the Outgunned RPG system. The first one is a homebrew scenario that I call Satellite Sabotage: The Musky Menace. I've actually run this scenario 4 or 5 times now, twice in person and the other times online. This was the first time running it with the actual physical products though, especially the Outgunned dice, adrenaline cards, and spotlight coins. In this scenario, the heroes need to prevent a tech billionaire named Elton Muskie from gaining world domination by taking out his satellite network. And I thought that it went very well. The players came up with smart and creative solutions. As a result, we skipped some scenes, so we were actually done after 3 hours instead of 4. As we got close to the finale, I checked in with the players to see if they'd prefer to drag things out some more, as I could have easily added another scene or 2. However, in the end, we all agreed that having an extra hour for lunch would not be a bad thing, especially as some players had back-to-back games. I also want to give a shout out to Shanbot, glad you could make it to the session. The second Outgunned game I ran was an off-book game for some friends of mine from the BSlandia community. We ended up with 6 players, which is a fairly large number for Outgunned. My sweet spot is actually 4, but I thought it worked well enough, even though I might tweak some things if I run for a similarly large group again. This game was inspired by the A-Team, but the premise was that the players got to create their own B-Team at the beginning of the session. And of course, with a table full of awesome players like this, everyone did a great job leaning into the premise. They called their team the Six-Pack, and their vehicle was an old beer delivery van. Whenever they opened the van doors, empty beer cans would fall out, and so on. The characters were great too. We had Harrigan playing a CIA agent who was a bit of a jerk. Hoos was playing a flirty spy. Edwin played the sleuth, who was a bit of a diehard. Gabe played Miss T, the ace and van driver. Kristen played the criminal. And last not least, Sean played the nobody, who was actually not officially part of the group at all, but instead working for Enterprise Rent-A-Car and somehow just kept getting dragged into the situation. I think we successfully hit on all the tropes from the A-Team TV show, with its over-the-top, non-lethal action. I had a blast, and I think everyone else had fun too. This was actually my final game of the convention on Sunday evening, and it was a nice way to put a cap on a great con. I'll definitely run the B-Team again. I think this would be a fun mini-campaign actually, essentially playing a couple of TV show episodes. Now let's talk about the games that I've played, starting with the official games I signed up for, followed by some more off-book games with friends. The first official game was called The Frontier Wild. This was actually a Savage Worlds game using the upcoming Sidewinder Recoiled Wild West setting. The GM was Carl Kiesler, and this was by far the best game of the con, and probably one of my best con game experiences ever. Carl is a fantastic GM, and we had a great group of players as well. Shout out to Laramie here. Carl normally runs games with elaborate terrain, miniatures, and so on, and some of these games are quite over the top in a good way. I had previously played in his Trailer Park Shark Attack game at Genghis Con in Denver. That was super fun as well, but it couldn't be more different from the Frontier Wild game I played at Gamehole Con. This was basically the Oregon Trail. There was some combat, but there were a lot of other interesting challenges as well, like river crossings, social engagements, crew disagreements, and things like that. I played Johann Müller, a German pioneer. He was on the wagon train along with his wife and kids, as well as 2 other German families that didn't speak any English. This ended up being relevant in a really fun scene where I had to translate some guidance from the Reverend to German. On a whim, being German myself, I ended up literally speaking German during that scene and actually translated the Reverend's words. I thought this ended up being a really fun scene. I don't want to spoil any of the plot in case you sign up for the game yourself. It's highly recommended. I missed the Sidewinder Recoiled Kickstarter earlier this year, but I'll be ordering it on DriveThruRPG as soon as it's out. It's a refreshingly different take on Wild West RPGs, dominated neither by Weird West elements as in Deadlands or Weird Frontiers, nor by spaghetti western action scenes, but rather by a historically accurate foundation, yet tasteful, respectful, and fun, especially with a top-class GM like Carl running it. There's a free jumpstart available for download. I'll link it in the description in case you want to check it out. Next we have a great dungeon crawl classics game that I played. This one was called Electric Funeral and was run by Brendan LaSalle. DCC is a game I enjoy a lot, and I've run a decent number of one-shots myself, but it had actually been a while, probably a couple of years since I last played it. Brandon is probably the most prominent DCC GM out there, but while I've seen him at many conventions, I've never had a chance to play in one of his games. This game was super fun. I don't want to spoil any plot elements, but we traveled to a different world, dealt with some interesting enemies and other challenges, and safely made it back. This was a level 4 game, which is refreshing, as many DCC con games tend to favor lower levels. The game included everything you'd expect from a DCC game, including several intense patron interactions. I chatted briefly with Brendan afterwards, who's a super nice guy by the way. He's still working out some rough edges, but it sounds like he might publish the game eventually, so look out for it. I also played an Alien game. This scenario confusingly was called Fallout, but it had nothing to do with the Fallout video game or Fallout RPG or anything like that. The GM was very solid as well. He had great system mastery, he brought a good energy to the table, and so on. And the players were good as well. The game was set in a station on a mining moon. It was very open-ended. There were different ways to enter the station, different ways to go about the mission. It was not a railroad at all. And it included all the elements one might expect from an Alien game. While I've played in a bunch of other Year Zero games, this was my first time playing the Alien RPG. I actually really like the overall mechanics, and especially how stress dice and panic work in the game. It captures the Alien vibe very well. I'll definitely play it again. I also played a cool pirate board game. I've mentioned pirate board before on my channel. While I'm not a huge fan of Morkborg descended games in general, Pirate Borg is awesome. The game's creator, Luke, is a really nice guy. He lives here in Colorado as well. I had a chance to chat with him a few times at Gamehole Con. He actually just ran another very successful Kickstarter for a Pirate Borg supplement, and I'm looking forward to it. Now, the GM for this particular session used the Pirate Borg rule set to run an old school Essentials adventure, The Secret of the Black Crag. This is an island crawl, and he essentially took the first level of the main dungeon. First, we had a short ship battle, which is great because I really like the Pirate Borg naval combat mechanics. After that, we entered the Black Crag, the main island that's part of this campaign, which was essentially a dungeon. We managed to clear out the first level, defeated a large undead pirate crew, and we escaped with a ton of treasure. This was a good game overall, but it felt more like an OSE game than a Pirate Borg game. There was no use of Ash or other sort of Pirate Borg typical aspects. The GM was good and engaging. One observation is that the other 5 players all knew each other. They were very nice and good players, but in terms of the energy at the table, I somehow felt a bit like an outsider. Not the end of the world though. Next we have the Electric State. This scenario was called The Man with the Van. The Electric State is a very unique dystopian setting with cyberpunk and apocalyptic elements, set in an alternate 1997. Similar to Tales from the Loop, the game is inspired by an art book by Simon Stalenhag. There's actually a movie coming out next year as well, featuring Millie Bobby Brown and Chris Pratt. In the game, players go on a road trip, and it's all about the journey and how it changes the characters. The game we played was fun overall, and definitely captured the dystopian road trip aesthetic, with crappy motels, bad fast food, and abandoned places. But my sense is that the Electric State would be much better as a campaign game as opposed to a one-shot. The characters' goals and flaws didn't really come into play, for example. I own the game, but so far it's not bubbling up to the top of the stack of RPGs that I'm interested in running. I'd play it again though, and I might take a closer look at it at some point. The last official game I played was called Ghosts of Ironsaddle, and this was using the Cypher system by Monty Cook. While I'm not necessarily a huge fan of the Cypher system, I've played a few Cypher one-shots in the past, and it's a perfectly fine game. I do like Wild West and Weird West settings though, so I figured I'd give it a shot. Unfortunately, this game was off to a rough start, as the GM didn't show up at first. It turns out there was some confusion about the day they were supposed to run. They eventually tracked them down though, and we were still able to play. What was intended as a quick starter combat to get us up to speed on the rules ended up taking quite a bit of time. The adventure itself was fine, but we had to cut the epic finale short because we were out of time, so the overall time management, which I realize is one of the hardest things about con games, could have been better. But the GM had good system mastery, was engaging, and did a good job portraying the NPCs. In addition to the official games and the off-book game I ran myself, I also played 2 fun off-book games with friends. The first one was Into the Odd, which was run by Harrigan. Into the Odd is an OSR game that I'd heard great things about, but hadn't played yet. The weird industrial setting never appealed to me when I checked it out in the past, so I don't actually own the book. Harrigan just might have convinced me otherwise though. The game is nice and simple, and character creation is quick and fun. He came up with a little mini hex crawl, and we explored a couple of hexes, dealt with some fun bandits, and ended with an epic and weird battle at an old observatory. Of course, my character was the first to die. No hard feelings though. This was a really fun session, really great. And the second game was Swords and Wizardry, run by Gabe, who previously ran a short Against the Dark Master campaign for us, and who is now prepping a Dune campaign. This was a very cool sandboxy spin on the legend of Sleepy Hollow. There was the Headless Horseman, as well as a haunted forest with a witch hut. We ended up essentially running two parallel adventure threads, with two of the player characters dueling with the Headless Horseman, while the others explored the forest and engaged with the witch. I was pretty sleep deprived that evening, so I don't think I was able to bring a lot of energy to the table. Still, it was a fun game with great players, and I'm glad I finally had a chance to experience Gabe running Swords and Wizardry, his go-to OSR game. That was it in terms of games. When I go to conventions, I usually try to get in a good mix of games that I know I like, but also try to experience some new games, and I feel like I've successfully accomplished both of those this time. In terms of the games, I feel like Gamehole Con offers a nice variety. There was everything from OSR and modern D&D games to Free League. There was also a decent number of indie games, although I think there's still room for even more growth on that front. Let's talk about some other impressions of Gamehole Con. First, we have the BSlandia Soiree. The only reason that I attended Gamehole Con in the first place is the Gaming and BS podcast. This started about 10 years ago, around the time I got back into playing RPGs after a long hiatus. Sean and Brett, the podcasters, both live in Wisconsin. Sean is local to Madison. The podcast ended a couple of years ago, but by that time it had formed an awesome community which continues to hang out on the Discord server. I've made many friends through this, both online and in person. At every Gamehole Con, there's a nice gathering of this community, and this year was no exception. I want to give Sean a shout out for fostering such a fun, engaging, diverse, and respectful community. He streams on YouTube on Saturday mornings, by the way. I'll put a link in the description. Really good seeing a bunch of BSers that I had previously met, but also meeting a bunch of new ones. So looking forward to next one already. Let's talk about food. Gamehole Con has a whole bunch of food trucks, which is convenient, so you can go out and grab lunch without having to drive to downtown, because the actual convention center is pretty remote. There isn't much in walking distance. There's actually only one restaurant, and that restaurant pretty much has 0 vegetarian options, which wasn't great for me the one time we ate there. Anyways, the food trucks are great. I feel like there was a nice variety, including plenty of vegetarian options. This was an improvement over 2 years ago, the last time I attended Gamehole Con. They had a Thai food truck, they had Indonesian, tacos, sandwiches, and a bunch of other options. Another thing to call out is the acoustics in the convention center. The first time I attended the convention, I noticed that it was very, very noisy in some of the rooms, and it was really, really hard to hear what was being said at the table and to focus on the game. It's still a challenge. There's just a lot of people on a relatively tight space, but I felt that this time the acoustics were quite a bit better. Some of the ballrooms had divider curtains, for example, which helped a lot. Gamehole Con also has a fun dealer hall. Many of the big players exhibit there, including Goodman Games, Free League, Chaosium, and others. But there are also many smaller vendors. I actually happened to sit next to one of them on my flight from Denver to Madison. This was a father and son team that made these really cool dice containers that look like donuts, with a coffee cup dice tower to go along with it. Super nice guy. I'll put a link in the description in case you want to check it out. And last not least, there are all the people at Gamehole Con. Overall, Gamehole draws a great and fairly diverse crowd. But mostly, it was really great hanging out and playing with existing friends, many of which I had only met online before, and making some new ones. I think attending Gamehole Con is now an annual ritual, and I'm already looking forward to next year. Hope to see you there sometime.